Welcome back to the Alibi Club, where every mystery is a case file waiting to be reopened.
I've watched that tape more times than I should have, and each time the mask looks closer, not a face. Tunguska never left us a face, just a pattern in scorched trunks and broken compasses that looks like something leaning in. The official word is simple. A rock from space met air and lost. The forest disagrees. The diaries disagree. Even the daylight disagrees. Because for weeks after June 30th, 1908, night forgot to be dark. I didn't come here for answers. I came because some mysteries rot if you don't excavate them. And this one, it sounds like it's still breathing. I didn't plan to start with an eyewitness. I wanted numbers, seismograms, barographs, clean instruments that don't tremble when the wind remembers. But in mysteries like this one, the first real clue isn't a graph. It's a voice that survived the blast long enough to doubt itself. I found mine in a retyped account, second-hand, then first, then something like a confession, disguised as routine. At about 7 in the morning, the sky split. June 30th, 1908. Siberia is a word people throw at emptiness to make it behave, but it doesn't. The taiga rolls for days like a green sea suspended in cold. There's a small cabin somewhere north of Vanavara, a stove that's gone cold because the night wasn't cruel enough to justify more wood. A man steps out to feed his dogs, and the air tilts. He will spend the rest of his life trying to explain the sound. Some say it arrived late, after the light, like the world remembered to scream, only after it saw its reflection. He describes a blue-white column, a second sun. Birds lift too slowly, as if their bodies are arguing with the instruction to fly. A shock. The earth heaves. The man thinks he's been thrown, but it's the trees that move. He's the only still point pinned to the moment, by a terror so clean it scrapes the soul. He didn't know the number then, around 2,000 square kilometers flattened in a butterfly shape, radiating from a point that refuses to be a point. Later, mapmakers would trace it with pencils that shook. The pattern is wrong for a simple impact, they'd say, but that morning, nothing had a shape yet. The dogs fell silent. The stove coughed ash without fire. Ash without fire. I underlined that twice when I read it, then once more when I visited, and found no crater. None. Just trees laid down like cards in a losing hand, their tops pointing away from the blast, as if pushed by a hand too large to see. People ask why there's no film. There is film, later film. Kulik's expedition in the 1920s. Gray figures in darker trees. Cameras staring at absence until it feels like an accusation. But the thing itself arrived before cameras could tell the truth fast enough. We have seismographs in distant cities, their needles twitching like a heartbeat caught off guard. We have barometric spikes. We have Londoners reading newspapers at midnight in a sky bright enough to blame on God or gaslight, whichever explanation hurt less. And we have wood, endless honest wood, telling the direction of the breath that pressed it flat. When air grows teeth, it leaves bite marks. The official story composes itself easily. A meteoroid or comet fragment enters the atmosphere at a shallow angle, compresses air in front of it until the heat climbs past what wood remembers. It detonates mid-air, around 5 to 10 kilometers up. A fireball becomes pressure waves, becomes falling trees, and stunned animals, becomes dust that rides the jet stream and bleaches European nights. If you want peace, stop there. But you and I did not click on the Alibi Club to stop where the paperwork ends. We keep walking until the file bleeds. I keep a rule when I investigate. Find what should be there, but isn't. At Tunguska, that list starts with a crater and ends with pieces, not rumors. Pieces we've sifted peat bogs and riverbeds, looking for iron beads or stony shrapnel with a chemical passport stamped interplanetary. There are possible microspherules. Yes, there are reports of strange silicates, short-lived isotopes, in tree rings, a whisper of beryllium-7 born in skies that scream, but nothing you can put on a table and point at while your voice goes calm. This is what hit us. I flew into Krasnoyarsk in late autumn, when the air tries to peel layers off your face and the locals laugh at your scarf. On the train east, I read Kulik's journals until the carriage blurred. He wrote about standing trees near Ground Zero, still upright, limbed and scorched, like a forest arrested mid-gesture. It's true, the telegraph pole forest is real, trunks sand-blasted clean, branches gone, bark burned, yet rooted. You see that geometry again in nuclear test sites, where the blast moves past a point too close to the detonation to be knocked over. The comparison is obscene and useful. Compare a way the forest doesn't file defamation suits. But even Kulik's notes wobble, whereas scientists' bones sometimes rattle. He expected a crater and didn't find one. Expectation is a narcotic in fieldwork. It makes you invent edges for holes that don't exist. He walked in circles across a swamp that clung to his ankles like a curse, sketching ovals of downed timber and trying to center them on a wound that refused to be pinned. You can grow old doing geometry with a ghost. I went to Vanavara to meet a family whose great-grandfather had kept a box. The box had papers, and under the papers, a small glassy pebble that wasn't glass. Dark, heavy. When I lifted it, it clung faintly to the magnet I'd brought, more curiosity than field test, and when I asked where it came from, the oldest woman shrugged. "The river," she said. "Everything comes from the river. If I had $1 for every mystery that ends at a river, I'd fund my own expedition." I recorded its weight, its indifference to a penknife, and I didn't pretend it answered anything. In Siberia, the past counterfeits itself. The pebble might be industrial slag lost from a 20th century truck. It might be a piece of deep time. Sometimes the only honest sentence you can write is "I don't know." But there is something I do know, and if you're watching this late, lights out, volume low, the kind of attention you only give someone telling you a secret, lean in. Tunguska is not empty. It's overcrowded with explanations. A cosmic bullet that never touched dirt, yet knocked a forest flat. A comet head of volatile ice that vaporized, leaving fingerprints of stratospheric dust, but no fingerprints you can hold. A stony body that exploded so cleanly it erased its own corpse. Or, if you prefer the versions told to frighten children and investigators, something not cataloged, not a rock or ice, a visitor of pressure and light that borrowed physics for a morning and returned it at noon, slightly dented. At some point, I stopped asking what hit Siberia and started asking who benefits from the fact that we still don't know. Not in a conspiratorial way, no trench coats in the tree line, just a practical question. What does mystery protect? Funding, folklore, the fragile dignity of certainty in a century that keeps losing it? When a culture can't decide what happened, everyone gets to keep talking, and talk is a kind of shelter. I fold the eyewitness account shut. The dogs are still silent. The stove still coughs ash without fire. And somewhere beyond this cabin, past the last human track in frost, the geometry of the fallen trees repeats itself like a sentence written by wind, one I intend to read, even if every letter slices my fingers. You'd think that after an explosion powerful enough to flatten 80 million trees, daylight would at least have the decency to leave. But it didn't. For weeks after the blast, night behaved like an imposter, thin, translucent, restless. Londoners wrote in their diaries that they could read their newspapers at midnight without a lamp. In Stockholm, children played in the streets after dark, unaware they were lit by the funeral glow of something that died halfway across the world. I keep a folder labeled Posthumous Daylight. Inside it, witness reports, photographs of pink horizons, and one telegram from a man who simply wrote, "The sun has stopped setting." I used to think atmospheric dust was poetry until I learned how sharp it feels inside your lungs. When Kulik's expedition returned, they found layers of fine particles scattered across lakes hundreds of kilometers away. Microscopic glass spheres, silicon, carbon. The explanation was elegant. The Tunguska body, whatever it was, had exploded high enough to inject dust into the stratosphere, scattering sunlight and painting twilight in impossible colors. But that elegance never lasts, because the numbers don't. The brightness lasted too long, spread too far, and refused to fade in the pattern that ordinary comet dust would. It's as if something else joined the atmosphere, a visitor that refused to leave politely. There's a photograph I can't stop staring at. St. Petersburg, 1908. A streetlight turned off, though it's midnight. The negative is overexposed, the shadows almost gone, as if the camera itself was confused by the light. I've run the spectrum analysis, too broad to be sodium vapor, too pale for aurora. When you stare long enough, the image gives you the feeling that the sky wasn't reflecting light. It was emitting it. I've interviewed physicists who laughed at that line, then stopped when I told them about luminous clouds, spotted weeks later, silver veils rippling at the edge of the mesosphere, the first recorded sightings of what we now call noctilucent clouds. Beautiful, yes, but beauty is sometimes the scar left by trauma. Let's talk about the air. The shockwave from Tunguska circled the globe twice. Instruments in London and Washington recorded the atmospheric pulse, a silent signature that told the story more faithfully than any survivor. The pressure spike was so intense it rattled barographs thousands of miles away. And yet, at the epicenter, people described the light as gentle before the blast hit. Gentle, then monstrous. Some said the color of the fireball changed from white to green to a red that hummed inside your skull. It sounds impossible until you realize that at such temperatures, air itself becomes plasma, and plasma sings. I found a letter written by an explorer who arrived in 1921, before Kulik. It was buried in a private archive in Tomsk. The ink had faded, but the last line punched through time. We saw the light walk across the river like a man made of fireflies. I wanted to dismiss it as hallucination, but I couldn't, not after finding 3 other reports from villagers describing luminous phenomena days after the explosion, columns of blue fire, streaks that behaved like living things. You start to wonder if the event didn't just end. It changed the sky's memory. Science does its best to explain dust scattering, chemical luminescence, high-altitude ice crystals. But there's a threshold where data stops feeling like an answer and starts sounding like a cover story. I remember one physicist in Irkutsk, old sharp, amused by my questions, leaning back and saying, "The light stayed because it didn't want to go." I laughed. He didn't. He pointed at a diagram on his wall showing electromagnetic disturbances in the ionosphere persisting far longer than they should. A burst like that doesn't only destroy, he said, it rearranges. Imagine you're there. You wake up in the middle of the night to a dawn that shouldn't exist. The sky is a bruised peach color. The air smells like ozone and metal. The birds are gone. You hold up your hand, and it's glowing faintly, reflected light. Maybe, or maybe not. You feel small. You feel watched. That's the part most testimonies leave out. The sense of being observed by the sky itself. When something bright enough to burn half a continent happens above you, maybe the primitive part of your brain stops caring about meteor trajectories and starts whispering, "It looked back." Every time I think about that persistent daylight, I remember a small experiment conducted decades later. A research group recreated microexplosions in a vacuum chamber, hoping to model the Tunguska airburst. They used metallic silicates suspended in gas and detonated them under controlled pressure. The result? A brief but measurable afterglow, plasma trapped in vortices, self-sustaining for seconds longer than expected. It doesn't sound like much, but scale that up to millions of tons of energy, and you get light that refuses extinction, light that remembers being alive. Theories multiply like spores in the dark. Some say a cometary nucleus of ice and methane entered the atmosphere and burned clean, leaving only gas and guilt. Others argue for an asteroid of iron-nickel vaporizing under stress, scattering its atoms too finely to find. There's even the antimatter hypothesis, proposed in whispers by people who should know better. A particle of opposite charge meeting ordinary air and annihilating itself in brilliance. The math falters, but the allure doesn't. And then there's the theory I hate the most, because it makes emotional sense even if it makes scientific nonsense, that Tunguska was a message, not sent, but expressed. The earth shrugging, the cosmos speaking, whatever metaphor you prefer. Something trying to be noticed. I went back to the coordinates. 60°55, in 101°57, E on satellite maps. The forest has healed unevenly. Some sections still resist regrowth, as if the soil remembers being too hot to forgive. You can trace the butterfly pattern from above, two wings of devastation, the body of absence between them. I don't know if you believe in psychological geography, but if landscapes can carry trauma, this one screams quietly every June. I stayed long enough to feel it. Even at noon, the shadows there feel off, too sharp, like the light doesn't know what direction it came from. At night, I camped on the edge of the flattened zone. The stars were bright enough to hurt. My watch glowed in the dark without help, a faint radioactive tint that didn't comfort me. Around 1 a.m., the horizon flickered, a soft pulse far away, but not thunder. I told myself it was distant lightning. I tell myself that about a lot of things. The next morning, my compass was wrong by 3 degrees, and maybe that's what the daylight was doing all along. Not shining, but resetting orientation, making sure that from that moment forward, every direction pointed somewhere slightly off. It's been more than a century since the explosion, But navigation systems, scientists, storytellers were all still compensating for that deviation. I should warn you, every investigation that's ever chased Tunguska deep enough ends the same way, in a swamp, with boots that don't come back. That's not metaphor, it's topography. The Podkamanaya Tunguska River Basin is a place that eats certainty alive, waterlogged ground, shifting moss, mosquitoes big enough to carry opinions. When Leonid Kulik first led his expedition there in 1921, he wasn't chasing fame, he was chasing the echo of a sound the world couldn't forget. But somewhere between the train at Tayshet and the endless marshes north of Vanavara, the story changed. It stopped being about a meteor. It started being about people disappearing into data. I found Kulik's field notes. Some copies, some originals, some rumored to be retyped by men who didn't understand Russian, but wanted to feel brave. He describes the journey with military precision at first. Distance traveled, rations consumed, bearings corrected, but halfway through the notebook, his handwriting changes, tighter, slanted, like the forest was whispering and he didn't want it to overhear. The compass refuses the north. One line reads, it circles as if searching for something to believe in. Another line. Later, the swamp glows faintly at night. You can almost see him, a middle-aged scientist with frostbitten fingers and too much conviction, dragging his team through the taiga. Locals refuse to go near the zone, calling it Valo Konpojibshik Zaveri, the Valley of Dead Animals. They said herds had died there after the blast, not burned, not torn, just fallen, their eyes open, as if their hearts had simply stopped from listening too closely. Kulik laughed at the superstition until he found the bones. They're still there, by the way, scattered across shallow peat and under the blackened roots of trees that should have turned to dust by now. Reindeer, elk, smaller mammals, and something larger, never cataloged. In his notes, Kulik describes a massive ribcage of unfamiliar proportion. His assistants thought it was a tree root until he unearthed symmetrical curvature. The sample went missing when they returned to Moscow. Some say the crate was misplaced. Others say it was confiscated. Either way, no photographs survive. Convenient. What fascinates me isn't the missing bones. It's what replaced them, stories of strange sickness. Kulik's men fell ill. Nosebleeds, dizziness, skin irritation, classic radiation-like symptoms, decades before Hiroshima gave us vocabulary for that kind of sickness. Yet no radioactive residue was ever confirmed. Kulik himself returned in 1927, 1928, 1929, each time weaker, more convinced the site was alive in ways we don't measure. He died before his final expedition in 1942, captured during the German advance. His body was never recovered. Another investigator, erased by geography. But Kulik wasn't the only one. Between 1921 and 1980, over a dozen expeditions followed his path. Scientists, military teams, even secret commissions under the pretext of geological surveys. A handful of names keep reappearing on lists, followed by abrupt terminations. One meteorologist wrote that he'd recorded a residual electromagnetic anomaly, a low hum below the threshold of human hearing, emanating from the central swamp. He died of heart failure 2 months later, age 32. His notes were burned for contamination risk. Another geologist vanished with 2 guides. Their camp was found untouched, tents still zipped, food unspoiled, notebooks dry, only the compasses were missing. There's an old superstition among locals. The ground hums when it remembers. I laughed when I heard it. Then I stood in the same swamp last year, microphone in hand, recording wind through reeds, just for texture. When I played it back that night, under the tent's thin canvas, I heard something else under the static, a low rhythmic oscillation, too regular to be natural. I sent it to a friend at the acoustics lab in Moscow. She ran it through filters. Her reply was one line: "Tell me this isn't from where I think it is." She found frequency patterns consistent with electromagnetic oscillations at 7.8 Hz, the Schumann resonance, the heartbeat of Earth's atmosphere. Normally faint, but at Tunguska, it spikes repeatedly, as if the Earth keeps replaying the same second of impact over and over. When I tell people about this, they ask if I believe the site is cursed. I don't use that word. I use reverberant. Some places hold an echo so perfectly, it starts producing new sound. Kulik thought he was studying an explosion. Maybe he was standing inside one that never fully stopped expanding. Then there's the aerial survey of 1938, declassified only recently. Grainy images of the blast zone show the radial pattern perfectly, like petals of a colossal flower, but also something else, a circular depression within the swamp, darker than its surroundings. At first it was dismissed as shadow, then later analysis found consistent magnetization anomalies directly above it. The flight crew never returned for follow-up photography. The next year, war consumed their orders. By the time peace returned, so had the forest covering, concealing, forgiving nothing. In 1958, another team, this time under Soviet military oversight, sent in geophysical sensors and a small contingent of soldiers to secure the site. Only half the data came back. The rest was reportedly classified for national security. When the documents resurfaced decades later, large sections were redacted, but one paragraph survived. It described metallic fragments extracted from permafrost at a depth inconsistent with sedimentation from 1908. Translation: the pieces were either older or newer than the explosion. Both options are absurd. The surviving lead scientist, Dr. Alexei Dobrovolsky, was interviewed in 1963. On record, he said, there was nothing extraordinary. Off record, according to a technician who was there, he said something else entirely. We found something looking back. He never elaborated. I tried to find the technician. He died in 1992, but his granddaughter remembered something strange. He kept a jar of soil on his desk. She told me, from the site, it glowed under the moonlight, faintly, like it had memory. I asked if she still had it. She said no. It vanished the night he did. Sometimes I wonder if Tunguska is less a mystery and more a mirror. The closer you get, the more it reflects your own obsession. Kulik saw science. The military saw threat. The conspiracy theorists saw aliens. I see compulsion, the need to make silence speak, because that's what swamps do. They absorb sound, hold it just long enough to whisper it back as something unrecognizable. Before I left the region, I visited a small memorial stone near Kulik Sep's last campsite. It steps simple, granite, chipped, unmarked, except for a line etched shallowly near the base. Locals say it wasn't set there originally. The line reads, "It fell from the sky, but it came from below." I don't know who carved it. I don't know if they were right. But as I walked away, I realized something unnerving. My boots, soaked and heavy, were sinking into soil that pulsed beneath me, not physically, but perceptibly, as if beneath the muck, the earth still inhaled once every few seconds. Breathing, waiting, remembering. Every investigator who steps into Tunguska eventually builds a shrine, not of faith, but of theories. You start with facts, lose them in the mud, and end up praying to whichever explanation feels least absurd. I've seen scientists argue until their cigarettes burned to filters and their voices cracked over one question. What was it? Theories are fossils of certainty, and Tunguska, more than any place on Earth, manufactures fossils faster than it buries them. The official one, stamped and archived, is the airburst theory. A stony asteroid, maybe 60 meters wide, enters the atmosphere at 45,000 miles per hour, compresses air until it becomes plasma, and detonates about 8 kilometers above the surface. No crater, no fragments, because everything vaporized midair. Simple. Elegant. The kind of explanation governments love. Neat enough to file under resolved. Vague enough to survive scrutiny. But the numbers never stop twitching. The energy release, estimated between 10 and 30 megatons, should have left detectable residues of nickel, cobalt, and iridium in the soil. It didn't, not in the concentrations we'd expect. The explosion's symmetry was off too. Instead of a neat circular flattening, there's that butterfly pattern, one wing larger than the other, as though the blast leaned. That asymmetry keeps me up at night. Then there's the comet theory. Romantic, if nothing else. A nucleus of ice and volatile compounds slamming into our air, exploding before touching ground, its water vaporizing and leaving no solid remains. It explains the glowing skies, yes, but it collapses under its own kindness. Ice at that speed would have disintegrated higher in the atmosphere. It shouldn't have packed enough punch to level a forest, and yet, that's what eyewitnesses describe. Trees flattened in all directions, shockwaves that shattered windows 600 kilometers away, heat that singed skin from miles off. The comet theory wants to be beautiful, but beauty doesn't crush reindeer herds in one breath. So scientists invented hybrids. Icy stones, stony ice, words that mean maybe both. But even the most flexible imagination can't stretch around Tunguska for long before it snaps. Because if you start looking at the data, not for what it shows, but for what it hides, the story mutates. The trees directly beneath the blast were not burned to charcoal. They were stripped and standing, their bark singed, their tops blown off, but their bases intact. The blast's directionality implies multiple pulses, not a single detonation. Something oscillated, something continued after impact. I met a physicist in Novosibirsk who whispered an old rumor, the antimatter hypothesis. He told it like a bedtime story you weren't supposed to hear. Suppose a small particle of antimatter, say a few kilograms, entered Earth's atmosphere. On contact, it would annihilate with regular matter, releasing energy equivalent to a multi-megaton blast. It would vanish completely. No crater, no debris, no trace but the light. He smiled, maybe out of embarrassment, maybe defiance. It fits, he said, except it's impossible. I asked why. He shrugged, because if it happened once, it would happen again, and we'd already be gone. Still, that theory lingers in the air like ozone. It explains the stratospheric glow, the absence of residue, the sheer purity of the explosion. but it replaces one impossibility with another. Where would the antimatter come from? Who or what would be guiding it? That's where the alien hypothesis slithers in, uninvited. In 1946, a Siberian newspaper published an article suggesting the explosion was a failed extraterrestrial landing. In the 1950s, as the UFO craze bloomed, writers claimed the blast pattern matched a controlled descent trajectory. One theory proposed the craft malfunctioned, detonating mid-air to avoid collision with a populated area. It's absurd, but absurdity doesn't always mean untrue. It just means unmeasured. I've read testimonies from elderly even key hunters who claimed they found metallic fragments with hieroglyphic markings years later, half buried in frozen bogs. I've chased those fragments, and every trail ends with the same line: it was taken away. But the strangest file in my collection belongs to a theory that starts on another continent, in another mind: Nikola Tesla. In 1908, Tesla was conducting wireless energy transmission experiments from his Warden Cliff Tower in New York. Some claim he was testing directed energy beams, and that he might have aimed one toward the Arctic to impress a colleague working in that region, perhaps accidentally triggering the Tunguska explosion. It's tempting, isn't it? A genius alone in his laboratory, a world away, sending lightning across the sky, never realizing he had just erased a forest. Tesla never mentioned Tunguska publicly, but his letters that summer stop abruptly. The tower went dark a year later. Whether he shut it down out of guilt or bankruptcy, history won't tell us. I've seen what happens when theories breed without supervision. They become myth. There are locals who say Tunguska wasn't a fall, but a rise, that something emerged from the ground and met something descending, an act of mutual destruction disguised as an explosion. That's why the soil still hums. That's why compasses shiver, because whatever met in that sky wasn't meteor and air. It was memory and matter colliding, two histories canceling each other out. Then there's the electromagnetic anomaly theory, less mystical, but just as haunting. Some researchers believe Tunguska was the result of a geomagnetic storm interacting with plasma structures in the upper atmosphere, a natural weapon built by the planet itself. The energy release would mimic a blast, but its origin would be terrestrial, not cosmic, the Earth discharging itself. If that's true, then Tunguska wasn't an accident. It was an exhale. Each theory leaves fingerprints on the next. They overlap, fuse, betray each other. And the strangest part? They all explain something, but none explain everything. The light, the magnetic distortions, the absence of debris, the sickness, the compass errors, the animals, the silence. To solve Tunguska, you'd have to invent a new category of event, something that sits between explosion and revelation. I sometimes think of Kulik's line, "The swamp glows faintly at night." I've seen that glow. Modern instruments can't explain it. It shifts wavelength like it's aware of being measured. I stayed up one night, alone, staring across the marsh, waiting for the glow to fade. It pulsed softly, rhythmically, like a heartbeat, and in the reflection on the water, I could swear it wasn't spreading outward. It was drawing inward, converging toward a single invisible point. That's when I realized the Tunguska event might not be over. Maybe it never was. Maybe it's still happening, its energy trapped in some loop of atmosphere and soil, a century-long exhalation refusing to end. A slow-motion detonation stretched across time. Theories can die, but Tunguska refuses to let them. Every few years, a new scientist, a new anomaly, a new satellite reading resurrects the question, and in the quiet between explanations, the forest keeps whispering the same sentence. It wasn't supposed to stop. You can tell where the blast line begins by the way the air changes. Not the smell, though there is one, like iron and frost, but the silence. The Tunguska forest doesn't hum like other forests. There are no birdsong layers, no insect static, no soft chaos, just a hollow stillness that feels borrowed, as if sound itself learned to stay away. I noticed it on my third day there, when I left the dirt road behind and walked into the zone where the trees start bending in one direction. It's subtle at first, then complete a symmetry born of violence. Some people call this regrowth. They say the forest has come back, but if you walk the way I did, with your eyes, not your optimism, you'll see it hasn't healed, it's reassembled. There's a difference. Healing implies the original structure returns. Reassembly means something else entirely. The land rearranges itself, not to restore what was lost, but to remember how it happened. I found a stand of young larches growing in spirals, their trunks corkscrewing upward instead of straight. A local biologist explained it as phototropism distorted by residual magnetism. I just nodded, pretending I understood. But that night, as the wind moved through them, the trees made a sound, faint whistling, like glass being bowed. It wasn't wind resistance, it was resonance, and when the gust passed, the sound didn't stop immediately. It lingered, like an afterthought. Kulik wrote about those trees too. He thought the forest was possessed of memory. Back then, it was poetic license. Now data agrees. Tree rings from Tunguska show irregular isotopic spikes, carbon-14 and beryllium-10 anomalies that align not just with the 1908 event, but with subsequent years, as though the trees kept recording an echo of it. The pattern repeats roughly every 11 years, matching the solar cycle. Coincidence, maybe. Or maybe whatever Tunguska was didn't just scorch the earth, it tuned it like a drum. The soil carries the same scar. Samples taken decades apart show inconsistent stratification, like someone stirred the ground with invisible fingers. Magnetic readings fluctuate unpredictably, compasses veering several degrees off, sometimes spinning. When I planted a small iron stake for calibration, it trembled slightly, as if the earth beneath it was whispering in Morse code. A geophysicist told me that permafrost melt could cause the movement. Nothing supernatural, he said. Then he paused and added, but it shouldn't be that rhythmic. You can walk for hours and feel watched, not by animals, they're scarce here, but by perspective itself. There's a phenomenon locals mention in passing. When you turn suddenly, the landscape seems to lag behind for a heartbeat, as if light is slightly slower here. I laughed the first time I heard it. Then it happened to me. I was crossing a clearing when my shadow didn't move quite right. For a fraction of a second, it felt delayed, detached from me, following reluctantly. I told myself it was fatigue. The brain misfires under isolation, especially when the air pressure dips. But later, reviewing my footage, there was a frame, a single one, where my shadow pointed in the wrong direction, away from the sun. Radiation levels remain low, officially, but vegetation grows faster than control samples, and fungal colonies seem unnaturally resistant to frost. In one site near the river, I found moss luminescent under UV, a trait normally reserved for marine species. I brought a small sample back to the lab. It pulsed faintly under microscopy, like breathing. The biologist I showed it to said it might be a fluorescence artifact, or she joked, maybe the forest is still photosynthesizing for whatever fell. I didn't laugh. The villagers nearby speak about the place the way survivors talk about trauma. They call it Zemlya bez sne, the land without sleep. Hunters avoid it. Their grandparents tell them the forest dreams differently there. If you sleep in the zone, one man told me, you'll wake up before you dream, and something else will keep dreaming for you. He said it without superstition, as if describing weather. I asked if anyone ever returned from those dreams. He smiled, a tired, half-lost smile, and said, no one remembers enough to say. The strangest part of Tunguska isn't what happened that morning in 1908. It's that the event is ongoing. Trees still fall prematurely. Birds avoid nesting. Magnetic anomalies persist. The ground swells and contracts seasonally in a pattern that defies thermal logic. Seismographs placed nearby register faint tremors, heartbeat-like pulses every 24 hours. No epicenter, no aftershock, just rhythmic shivers as if the planet keeps replaying the same internal memory. I sat one evening at the forest's edge, watching the mist coil between the trunks. It moved unnaturally low, not rolling but folding, like a fabric being tucked into itself. For a moment I thought I heard a whisper, not in the air, but in the soil beneath my boots, a vibration more than a sound. You can't translate vibrations, but if I could, I'd swear it said something close to still falling. It reminded me of a satellite photo I'd studied back home. The regrown forest forms a near-perfect circle, but with a lighter patch in the center, vegetation that never quite takes root. Scientists call it a growth depression zone. To me, it looks like an eye that refuses to close. Every summer, new saplings sprout there, only to wither within months. Not from disease, from something subtler. Their roots hit a layer that feels warm even in midwinter. When probed with thermometers, the temperature is a steady 2 degrees Celsius higher than surrounding soil. No geothermal source, no rational reason, just warmth, as if something beneath the ground is still radiating faintly, waiting. Before I left, I pressed my hand to the soil at the center of that clearing. It wasn't hot, but it wasn't dead either. The vibration was real, slow, like a pulse too deep for stethoscopes. I counted 7 beats before pulling away. The forest had a heartbeat, or maybe I was the one who didn't. As I packed up, a local ranger asked what I Sept found. I told him the forest remembers. He nodded, not surprised. Of course, he said, you can set erase light. You can only plant trees on top of it. That night, back at my cabin, the wind carried a distant sound, low, continuous, almost metallic. It came from the direction of the blast site. I thought it was thunder until I checked the sky. Clear, silent. The stars didn't flicker. They trembled. The next morning, every compass needle in my pack was pointing toward the same place. Not north, just back. Science doesn't like ghosts. It likes clean conclusions and repeatable data, not forests that hum or soil that remembers heat a century later. Yet, one by one, scientists who came to Tunguska with calculators and skepticism left with something else, a hesitation in their voices, a pause before the word impact. The deeper they looked, the less the event behaved like physics, and the more it behaved like a story trying to rewrite itself. In the 1960s, the Soviet Academy of Sciences classified Tunguska as a resolved cosmological phenomenon. Officially, it was done. Unofficially, something kept bothering the data. The problem wasn't the explosion. It was the absence of a crater, even a shallow one. In every other recorded airburst, like Chelyabinsk in 2013, debris was found. But Tunguska? Nothing. Just trees bent outward in a perfect radial pattern, as though a god had exhaled straight down. By 1970, several researchers, Zolotov, Krinov, Fast, and others, had quietly started calling Tunguska an unclassifiable event. They never used that word in journals. They used it in bars, whispered between vodka glasses when the tape recorders were off. I interviewed one of their assistants decades later. He said, "They knew something didn't add up. They just couldn't afford to say so." The Cold War made honesty a luxury. In the late 1950s, the Soviets launched satellite reconnaissance programs, ostensibly to map resource zones, but also to monitor strange magnetic readings over central Siberia. The images they captured were never published, but fragments of reports leaked years later, referencing persistent thermal anomalies in the Tunguska region during winters when temperatures should have killed everything. One document mentioned a localized increase of radiation levels detectable from orbit. No one dared speculate why. The term used was non-nuclear heat source. In 1976, a geochemist named Alexei Zolotov broke ranks. He wrote an internal memo arguing that the Tunguska blast site showed continued ionization signatures inconsistent with atmospheric origin. He proposed that the explosion had penetrated into the Earth's magnetic field rather than simply dissipating in the atmosphere. That memo was confiscated, and Zolotov was reassigned to a lab in Leningrad to study fertilizer composition. He never published again. The story repeats like a formula. A scientist notices something, reports it, gets moved, silenced, or redirected. By the 1980s, the investigation had become less about finding answers and more about protecting explanations. Yet nature refused to cooperate. In 1983, an Italian satellite equipped with infrared sensors picked up sporadic heat signatures, each one precisely over the Tunguska coordinates, each one lasting only minutes. The Soviet Union denied any anomaly. Instrument error, they said. But later analysis confirmed the readings matched low-level plasma discharges, as if something in the atmosphere there still occasionally ionized itself for no reason. When I spoke to Dr. Galina Petrovna, a retired astrophysicist who once worked at the Irkutsk Observatory, she told me something she'd never said publicly. We set up field spectrometers near Vanivara in '85, she said. The readings were fine during the day, but after midnight, the ionization levels tripled. It wasn't solar, and it wasn't cosmic. It came from below. The moms were cement. She sighed. Sometimes the ground radiated as if it remembered light. Even Western scientists eventually admitted their equations didn't quite fit. In the 1990s, NASA sponsored computer simulations of airburst to replicate Tunguska. Every version produced either too much debris or too little blast pattern. The models couldn't match both. A scientist from the Jet Propulsion Laboratory described it privately as an anomaly wearing a disguise. It's easy to dismiss anomalies. Harder when you stand among 80 million flattened trees that still refuse to decay at a normal rate. Harder still when the forest occasionally lights itself blue. Then came 2007. A European-Russian joint team conducted soil tomography scans to finally end the debate. They found something unexpected, a dense metallic object roughly 50 meters underground, about 30 meters in diameter. The official explanation, glacial erratic. The unofficial one, buried mass consistent with a high iron body. When they attempted to drill, the equipment failed repeatedly. Sensors shorted out, batteries drained. The team withdrew, citing logistical challenges. The files went dark after that. I've tried requesting them through every archive I know, denied each time. But an engineer on that project, now living quietly in Prague, told me during a late-night call, it was there, something solid, and it was warm. I asked the Daspian, warm. He paused, warm enough to fog the permafrost. When the Soviet Union collapsed, secrecy did too. In the early 2000s, private research groups returned to Tunguska. One of them, the Kazan Geophysical Collective, reported finding anomalous magnetization zones, forming concentric circles. They theorized the ground had become ferromagnetically polarized, like a recording medium, capturing the event the way a vinyl groove captures a song. Their paper never passed peer review. The reviewers didn't reject the data. They rejected the implication, because if the ground itself could retain memory of an explosion, what else could it remember? I found a later note from one of the researchers, handwritten and unsigned. Perhaps the event was not an explosion, but an imprint, the Earth reacting to being observed. You hear sentences like that enough times, and they start feeling less metaphorical. Even I, who came here for rational truth, have caught myself saying things that sound like superstition. The forest knows, the soil breathes, the air listens. Maybe that's what the scientists realized too, that Tunguska isn't just a place, it's a system that doesn't want to be solved. When a phenomenon becomes self-defensive, you stop calling it a mystery, you start calling it an organism. Before she retired, Dr. Petrovna gave me one last piece of advice. Don dester hesavadistar. It moves, and maybe that's why no theory fits. Maybe the Tunguska explosion isn't frozen in time. Maybe it's alive, its epicenter sliding subtly year by year, like a ripple that refuses to die, a pulse moving beneath us, waiting for the next alignment, when daylight will refuse to leave again, and the world will remember what fell through its sky. There's a kind of silence that doesn't mean absence. It's a full-body thing, a pressure on the ribs, the feeling you get when a sound has just stopped, but your brain is still bracing for the next note. Tunguska has that silence. The first time I played back my field recordings from the blast zone, I thought the mic had failed. 10 minutes of nothing. No wind, no insects, no distant birds, just an emptiness so dense it felt intentional. Then, when I boosted the gain, the waveform trembled. There was something down there, lower than hearing, slower than heartbeat. The record that shouldn't sit exist. The Irkutsk Observatory archived one phonograph cylinder from 1908, a fragile wax coil labeled Barometric Oscillation Experiment. June 30th. When digitized in the 1990s, researchers expected to hear the hiss of instruments. Instead, they heard a single concussive pop, followed by a 12-minute rumble that ebbed and swelled like breathing. Microphones didn't exist in Siberia. Then this was a mechanical trace of air pressure translated to sound. It matched seismograph data from Britain and Italy, except for one anomaly. The frequency dipped, rose, then repeated at perfect 2-minute intervals, a rhythm. When I asked an acoustician to analyze it, she called back whispering, "That's impossible," she said. "Atmospheric waves don't echo that long. Something was sustaining it." She sent me a spectrogram. Across its surface ran a thin horizontal line, constant, unwavering, 7.83 Hz, the planet's own background frequency. The Schumann resonance, the same pulse my field recorder caught in the swamp. The hum beneath speech. Locals talk about a bass ton, a low hum you can't locate. Hunters claim it moves through the soil at night, rising from the ground into the chest. Some describe it as comforting, others as interrogation. A geologist once placed vibration sensors along the riverbank. Every night at 2:17 a.m., they registered a faint tremor lasting exactly 108 seconds. No seismic source. The signal wasn't random. It carried harmonics, as if the ground was replaying a word it couldn't pronounce. I took a portable accelerometer and tried it myself. First night, nothing. Second night, a flutter, almost like a generator, far away. Third night, right before dawn, the readings spiked. My headphones filled with a sound halfway between thunder and a human breath. It wasn't loud. It was close. When it faded, the forest around me seemed to exhale, the trees creaking as if relieved. Vanished tapes. In 1965, a Soviet radio engineer named Sergei Obrushev set up magnetic reels near the blast center to study atmospheric resonance. He recorded 3 nights. The first 2 reels survived. Wind, static, normal. The third was classified. According to his assistant's diary, that reel contained voices, not human voices, not language, just modulated tones that formed patterns resembling speech cadence. The reel was confiscated. The assistant was reassigned to meteorology in Yakutsk. No one ever heard from Obrushev again. Years later, fragments resurfaced through bootleg radio archives, a 5-second loop of that tape. I've heard it. It begins with static, then a slow rising note that bends down and up again, like someone testing vowel sounds underwater. Some researchers call it interference. Others, braver ones, say it's the planet vocalizing its injury. Sound as memory. Acoustic physicist Helena Kurowska once told me, after Tunguska, the atmosphere rang like a bell for hours. That wasn't poetic exaggeration. Barometers across Eurasia detected standing acoustic waves circling the globe. The atmosphere had turned into a resonant chamber. Normally those waves fade. This one didn't. It kept circling for nearly 36 hours before dispersing. Imagine a bell so large it takes a day and a half to stop ringing. Then imagine standing inside it. When I asked Lena what that would feel like, she said, "You'd hear nothing, but you'd know. That's Tunguska's signature paradox, an event so loud it erased its own echo." The Cold War recordings. In 1974, U.S. satellites monitoring nuclear tests picked up an infrasound anomaly over central Siberia. It wasn't an explosion. It was a pulse, brief, patterned, identical to the 1908 waveform, delayed by 66 years to the day. The data was quietly filed under atmospheric noise recurrence, but a declassified memo from 1982 suggests otherwise. Signal resembles residual coupling of Tunguska atmospheric resonance. Recommend continued monitoring in centennial window. They expected it to happen again in 2008, the 100-year mark. Officially, nothing did. Unofficially, several weather stations reported equipment malfunction between June 29th and July 1st. Hard drives wiped clean. Paragraphs stuck mid-trace. One technician wrote in his log, "It was quiet, but too quiet." The pattern of listening. Here's the part that haunts me. The signal doesn't just transmit. It reacts when recording devices are left unattended. Nothing registers. When someone listens in real time, the pulse strengthens. It's as if awareness amplifies it. Observation itself becomes the microphone. Quantum physicists would call that nonsense. Investigators like me call it motive. I began testing the idea. I left 2 identical recorders overnight. One running live with my headphones on, one sealed in a case. At dawn, the live feed captured the hum. The sealed one captured only static. The signal somehow knew when it was being observed. Maybe that SEP's the meaning behind the villagers' SEP, saying the silence listens back. The interview that ended in static. The last scientist I spoke to was Dr. Yuri Stepanovich, a radio wave analyst who monitored Tunguska SIP's electromagnetic noise for 2 decades. He told me, every time we measure, it adapts. Frequencies shift just above human hearing, like its SIPs avoiding translation. I asked him what he thought it was. He said, communication, but not directed at us through us. A week after our interview, he vanished from his lab outside Krasnoyarsk. His equipment was found running, reels spinning into static. The final recording, timestamp 2:17 a.m., contained one whisper between bursts of noise. Not in Russian, not in any language I recognize. I ran it through spectral software. The translation program returned a single English word again. Sometimes I replay that fragment late at night. The waveform dances across my screen, faint and deliberate, like handwriting under glass. When the sound fades, the room feels heavier. That's when I understand why the villagers never speak loudly near the site. Because somewhere under that forest, the silence is still practicing pronunciation. It began the same way it ended, without warning. At first, no one connected the dots. A pilot over northern Norway reported that the horizon glowed unnaturally. Amateur photographers in Scotland uploaded time-lapses showing twilight refusing to fade. Then came the meteor reports, blue streaks that vanished halfway down, leaving behind not darkness, but a faint, impossible day. June 30th, 2008, 100 years to the day. I remember that night because my phone wouldn't stop vibrating. Researchers, journalists, doomsday enthusiasts, everyone asking the same question. Was it happening again? I told them no, because denial is easier when the sky looks wrong. By midnight, satellites picked up high-altitude luminescent clouds expanding over the Arctic. They weren't supposed to form that early in summer. Their altitude, composition, and geometry matched the data from 1908 almost perfectly. It was like the atmosphere had opened an old wound. NASA called it a centennial coincidence. The Russian Meteorological Service blamed ice particles, but the images betrayed them. Circular auroral rings over central Siberia, eerily centered on the same coordinates as the Tunguska blast. And though the night was clear, the light behaved as if refracted through something unseen, as if the air had density. The daylight that refused to end. People across Europe woke up confused. Curtains glowed at 3 a.m. Newspapers ran headlines like Midnight Dawn, and the sky forgot darkness again. Some thought it was a new form of aurora. Others said satellites reflecting sunlight. But the glow wasn't just above, it was around. Shadows vanished. Light had no direction. I was already en route to Vanavara when the news broke. My flight from Krasnoyarsk took off in full daylight and landed at 11 p.m. with the same daylight waiting for me. No sunset, just a sickly gold hue, as if the air was full of memory. The locals were silent. They'd seen this before, or their grandparents had. "Don't stay past dawn," one of them warned. "Why?" I asked. He just said, "Because dawn isn't set where you think it is." That first night, I stood at the riverbank where the original shockwave had once rolled through. The water was mirror still, but the reflection didn't match the sky. The stars shimmered above me, yet below in the river's surface there was an extra one, faint and pulsing. It wasn't on any chart. When I moved, it didn't. When I looked directly at it, it dimmed. When I looked away, it brightened, like it preferred being remembered indirectly. The repeating glow, instruments confirmed what my eyes already knew. Atmospheric ionization was climbing. The same low-frequency hum recorded in 1908 had returned stronger this time, spanning 200 kilometers in radius. Every few minutes it pulsed. My radiation badge flickered erratically. Not dangerous, just inconsistent, like the laws themselves were momentarily distracted. Villagers began complaining of strange dreams. Not nightmares, but vivid, repeating visions of forests collapsing in reverse, trees rising back into place, leaves reattaching, light flowing upward instead of down. One man said he dreamt of the explosion, but from inside it. It wasn't hot, he told me. It was awake. By the second night, global sensors confirmed a measurable increase in atmospheric conductivity. In simpler words, the sky was starting to behave like a conductor again, exactly as it had a century ago. But there was no meteor incoming, no object, nothing from above. The energy was rising from the ground. Satellite magnetometers caught spiral formations in the ionosphere, rotating counterclockwise, like a fingerprint pressing outward. One scientist described it as a geomagnetic reenactment. Another called it the Earth remembering its own scream. The Watchers. Around 2 a.m., a team of geophysicists arrived with new ground sensors, ultra-sensitive devices designed to pick up subsurface energy flows. We installed them near the old epicenter. Within minutes, the readings went wild. Not random. Patterned. The data displayed repeating numbers, 1908.0630, the date of the original event. I thought it was an equipment glitch until the same sequence appeared on two independent systems, one analog, one digital. The Earth was somehow broadcasting its trauma like a timestamp. And then, just before dawn, the light changed color. It shifted from gold to an indescribable hue, half cyan, half violet, like sunlight seen through closed eyes. It painted the treetops without casting shadows. Cameras overexposed instantly. Sensors died. For 47 seconds, the forest glowed from within. When the light receded, everything felt lighter. Literally, my body weighed less. Instruments confirmed a brief drop in local gravitational strength by 0.04%. Then it normalized, as if the world had sighed. Later analysis of atmospheric data revealed that during those 47 seconds, the Schumann resonance frequency doubled. The planet's heartbeat had skipped. It wasn't an explosion this time. It was a reminder. The things that followed after the event, compasses everywhere, within 100 kilometers, locked in the same direction. Not north, not magnetic, but pointing toward a single coordinate, deep inside the forest. The same place where decades earlier, a drill had struck something solid and warm. I went there the next morning. The path was new. The forest had rearranged itself. Young birches growing in spirals like before. At the center, the ground bulged upward slightly, no more than half a meter, as if something beneath had shifted. I placed my palm on it. The vibration was still there, stronger now, steady, like breathing through rock. I don't know how long I knelt there, hand on the earth, waiting for it to speak again. But when I stood, the air felt thinner, charged. The sunlight returned to normal color. The birds came back. Even the compasses behaved. The phenomenon had ended. At least, that sips what I told the reporters. But when I reviewed my data that night, I found something new, a final pulse in the recording, distinct from the others. It wasn't random noise. It formed a pattern, a waveform matching the human electroencephalogram, the brain's alpha rhythm. It's as if the Earth's resonance had synced, just for a moment, with thought. The voice of memory. A week later, at a symposium in Novosibirsk, I presented the findings. Half the audience smiled politely, half shifted uncomfortably. One scientist whispered, "You steer saying the planet has a mind." I said, I'm saying it remembers, because that's what the Tunguska event feels like now, not a past catastrophe, but an ongoing rehearsal. The explosion might have been a message, a 1-second conversation between the Earth and something else. And this century later, the reply finally arrived, in light instead of sound. When night returned, I went outside again. The stars looked ordinary. The air was calm. But somewhere beyond the tree line, I could still see it, the faintest shimmer in the distance, like the afterimage of a thought. The daylight hadn't vanished. It had just learned how to hide. When you dig through a century of silence, every surviving voice sounds like a confession. His name was Mikhail Potapov, and according to the faded census records, he should have been dead 30 years ago. Instead, I found him alive in a nursing home near Tomsk, 99 years old, half blind, still speaking in the clipped dialect of the even-key reindeer herders. He had been 8 when the sky fell. Every official account listed him as lost during the evacuation. Somehow he never corrected the record. They said he didn't talk to journalists. I didn't tell them I wasn't one. I brought a tape recorder, a bottle of rye, and patience. He didn't drink anymore, but he appreciated the gesture. He asked if I believed in ghosts. I said I wasn't sure. He smiled, toothless but sharp. "Then maybe you still hear what I saw," he said. He spoke slowly, his memories tangled between Russian and Evenki words that translators have always failed to capture. But when he described the morning of June 30th, 1908, his voice steadied. "The dogs barked before the light came," he said. "They barked at the air." I asked what he saw. He closed his eyes. "It wasn't set fires," he said. "It was something bright, but cold, like a sun that didn't sit belong to us." He gestured upward, trembling. It came down slow, not fast. The sound was already there before it arrived. The air went hard, like glass. He paused, coughed, then added softly, "It didn't fall." That's the part no one recorded before. Every other witness spoke of a meteor streaking, exploding, but Mikhail described stillness, not motion. It hung above the trees, he said. Then the light folded itself, and everything went white. He remembered being thrown to the ground, hearing nothing, and waking to find his family gone. The forest flattened, the reindeer dead, eyes open, steam rising from the earth. But above him, the sky was perfectly clear. No smoke, no clouds, just an emptiness so clean it hurt to look at. What do you mean it stopped? So he leaned closer. It was looking, he whispered, like it wanted to see who was watching. At first, I thought it was senility, a trick of memory polished by decades of isolation. But something in his description matched Kulik's earliest sketches, an upward motion recorded seconds after the blast. Kulik had dismissed it as debris cloud, but Mikhail insisted the light went back. That night, after our talk, I stayed in a hotel near the river. I listened again to his voice on tape. There was a faint hum behind his words, steady, low frequency, the same pattern I'd recorded in the forest. I checked the equipment. No interference. It was the room itself. The hum rose when he spoke of the light, fell when he went silent, almost like resonance, like the air remembered. The next morning, I visited him again. He was sitting by the window, staring at the snow. You came to find the crater, he said before I even opened my mouth. Yes, I admitted. You won nest, he said, because its nest's not in the ground. He pointed upward again, not at the ceiling, but beyond it. Every year, on that morning, it comes back for a moment, he said. You can see it unless you look at the water. I asked if he meant reflection. No, he said. The water shows the part the sky forgets. After he fell asleep, I asked the staff if anyone else had ever interviewed him. They shook their heads. Sometimes he talks in his sleep, one nurse said. Always the same words. What words? She frowned, trying to recall. Something like set, tits not falling, tits returning. That evening, I drove out to the frozen Podkamennaya Tunguska River, a few kilometers north of the original site. The ice glowed faintly under moonlight. I knelt and placed my recorder near a crack in the surface, and first, only wind. Then something else, a dull, steady rhythm beneath the ice, spaced like breathing. When I amplified the signal later, I found modulation, tiny fluctuations forming a pattern. Not random, mathematical. The spacing between pulses corresponded to the exact geographic coordinates of the Tunguska epicenter, as if the Earth was whispering its own location, again and again to anyone who'd forgotten where it hurt. I sent the waveform to a colleague at the Institute of Planetary Physics. He called back 2 days later. This can be natural, he said. Then what is it? He hesitated. It sets not transmitting out. It sets reflecting. Something sets still bouncing back. I returned to Mikhail a final time. He was weaker now, barely lifting his head. I told him what I'd recorded. He smiled. Then you've heard it too, he said. What is it, Mikhail? He looked past me, toward the ceiling again. Not a rock, not a star. It was a door. He took a deep breath. The forest is the scar, not the wound. The wound is still open. His eyes went distant. I thought he was fading into sleep, but then he whispered one last thing. It fell up. He died 2 days later. The staff said it was peaceful, though they couldn't explain why every radio in the building hissed for exactly 7 minutes at the time of his death. My tape recorder, left on his bedside table, captured the static too, and underneath it, faint but clear, the same 7.83 hertz hum, steady as a heartbeat. Back in my lab, I replayed his final words. Between the breaths and static, I caught an echo that wasn't on the original tape. A voice, my own, though I never said it aloud, whispering the same words he did. It fell up. I don't know how to explain that. Maybe the sound was feeding back. Maybe the event, whatever it was, had finally found a witness willing to repeat its sentence. Or maybe the sky, after a century of silence, had simply learned to use our voices. There's a point in every investigation where evidence starts to behave like rumor, when data stops describing what happened and starts describing what's happening again. Tunguska crossed that line the moment I realized it never ended. The explosion wasn't a conclusion, it was an introduction. A century later, we're still inside the echo of something that arrived and decided not to leave. When I returned from Tom's, I carried Mikhail's tapes in a lead-lined case, as if they were relics instead of recordings. At my apartment in Moscow, I replayed the river hum and his frail voice on loop. Each time, the background resonance changed slightly. On the fifth listen, I noticed the pulse speeding up, fractionally at first, then enough that my instruments detected a temporal drift of several milliseconds. It shouldn't be possible for a fixed recording to alter its own frequency over time unless it wasn't fixed. That's when I began to suspect that the Tunguska event hadn't just carved a scar in space, it had carved one in time. The pattern that reappeared when I overlaid the modern magnetic data from the 2008 Return of the Light with archived seismograph readings from 1908, the waveforms aligned perfectly. The same peaks, the same troughs, down to the microsecond. The pattern wasn't repeating, it was continuing, as though one long tremor had simply been paused for a century. And there was something else. Between both datasets, between the shock of 1908 and the resonance of 2008, lay a faint harmonic frequency pulsing at human alpha wave rhythm. The same one I'd captured beneath the forest soil. The same one that had whispered through Mikhail's final recording. I sent the files to a neuroscientist friend who owed me a favor. He called at 3 in the morning, breathless. "This isn't set noise," he said. "This is structured like EEG data. You stir not recording a place. You stir recording something alive. The thing beneath the forest, back in Vanavara. Excavation rights are strict, but quiet permissions exist for those who ask the right people. I joined a private expedition under the guise of collecting core samples for permafrost study. Beneath 5 meters of topsoil, we hit the warm layer again. No resistance, just stillness. The sensors read a magnetic field 5 times stronger than the background level. The metal casing of the drill began to vibrate audibly, like a tuning fork catching a note only it could hear. Then the power died. Every digital device we carried flickered out, even the mechanical compass spinning like it had lost its planet. When we pulled the drill back up, its tip glowed faintly for several seconds, even in daylight. We left immediately. One of the local guides refused to return the next day, muttering, "It woke up." We analyzed the residue later, traces of silicon nickel and an unknown crystalline compound that refracted polarized light in impossible angles. The microscope showed lattice structures that behaved more like memory storage than mineral formation. Whatever was down there wasn't rock, it was remembering the eyes of the Earth. In 2010, researchers from Irkutsk ran a satellite magnetometer sweep of the Tunguska region. One frame, buried in terabytes of static data, showed something that stopped me cold, a geometric anomaly, circular, faintly luminous, 40 meters wide. The spectrum suggested low-level ionization, like the afterglow of lightning trapped in air that refused to disperse. But the anomaly had structure, concentric rings, each vibrating at slightly different frequencies, forming what looked disturbingly like an iris, an eye under the forest. The official report called it instrument interference due to solar reflection. The raw data was quietly deleted from public archives 6 months later. But I saved my copy because I needed to believe what I saw, even if belief meant losing everything else. The experiment that proved too much. I'm not a believer in rituals, but after decades of being lied to by both governments and equations, I decided to provoke the truth. Using portable Tesla coils and a low-frequency generator, I attempted to recreate the 7.83 Hz pulse across the swamp. The idea was simple. If the Tunguska anomaly was electromagnetic in nature, maybe it would respond to resonance. It did. At first, nothing, just the whine of the generator. Then the air thickened. Static prickled on my skin. The sound deepened until I couldn't tell if it was external or inside my chest. My equipment recorded a sudden spike in atmospheric ion density, then a drop in gravitational field strength, just like 2008. And in that moment, the ground beneath me breathed. Not metaphorically. I felt the peat rise and fall beneath my boots, slow and deliberate. I cut the power immediately. But the pulse continued for another 30 seconds before fading back into the soil, like something sinking back to sleep. I packed up that night and burned the data cards. I told myself it was fear, but it was respect. The message in the frequency. A year later, I received an email from an anonymous address. No text, just an attached audio file titled Answer. I nearly deleted it, assuming it was a prank. But curiosity has teeth. I played it through spectral software. It wasn't voice, not in any normal sense. It was the same Schumann frequency, but modulated, encoded. I slowed it down, inverted it, filtered it through linguistic pattern recognition. The translation algorithm hesitated, then produced 3 words: "We are still here." It wasn't alien. It wasn't divine. It was familiar. The syntax resembled human brainwave entrainment, like a mirror signal bouncing back through us, as if whatever Tunguska awoke had found a way to speak using our own neurological rhythm. The realization, that's when it hit me. The Tunguska event didn't just destroy 2,000 square kilometers of forest, it connected them. Every atom of vaporized soil, every tree atomized and redeposited, became part of a conductive web. The region itself had turned into a biogeophysical circuit, using the Earth's magnetic field as both antenna and bloodstream. The explosion wasn't an impact, it was an activation. What entered the atmosphere in 1908 wasn't an object, it was a signal, a self-replicating pattern of energy, looking for a host large enough to sustain it. It found one in the planet itself. And if that sounds like madness, remember this: every year, around June 30th, the Schumann resonance spikes across the globe, not locally, globally. Instruments in Japan, Chile, and Alaska all hum at the same impossible frequency for one day. The world breathes in unison. That's SEP's not coincidence. That's SEP's continuity. When I finished writing this report, I noticed something strange on my recorder, the hum that followed me through every stage of this investigation. 7.83 heads had vanished. The waveform was flat, silent. For the first time in months, Tunguska wasn't speaking. Then I realized why. Because I was. Because I had taken its story, amplified it, released it. The silence had passed through me, into you. So if you're hearing this now, turn the volume down a little. Listen closely, in the quiet between my words. That low vibration you think is static, that tips not the microphone. That sips the earth. Remembering you, remembering it, I've spent half my life chasing a sound that no one else could hear. What began as a meteor story became a confession, one whispered by the planet itself through broken trees, humming soil, and a century of wrong answers. We called it the Tunguska explosion because we needed a word for endings. But I don't think anything ended here. Walk into that forest now, and you'll feel it. The faint vibration under your boots, the way light bends just slightly too long before dusk. That's not imagination. That's the after image of an awakening still echoing through the crust. The world isn't solid. It's a resonant chamber, and something struck it so hard that it started to hum back. Science will tell you it was an asteroid, a comet, a burst of air. Myth will say it was punishment, prophecy, or proof of visitors. But those are just languages trying to name the same thing, attention. For one bright, unbearable second, in 1908, the Earth was seen, completely, absolutely, and it has been reacting to that gaze ever since. Sometimes I think about Mikhail, staring upward from the snow, whispering, it didn't set fall, it stopped. Maybe that SEP's all the explanation we ever get. Maybe the Tunguska event wasn't something that fell from the sky, but something that arrived and realized it liked the view. If you stand at the epicenter on a windless night and listen long enough, the silence thickens until it feels like breath. And if you match it, inhale and exhale in rhythm with the ground, you'll notice it aligns with your own heartbeat. You'll feel it, how the planet waits for you to answer, how every life above its surface vibrates at the same buried frequency, unknowingly keeping time with the oldest pulse there is. We keep calling it an explosion, but what if it was a question? What if the blast wasn't destruction, but recognition? The Earth didn't instead burn that morning. It spoke, and we've spent 100 years pretending not to understand.